Hello, my name is Bob Sobzak. I'm a hydrologist with the National Park Service at Big Cypress National Preserve in South Florida. The title of this talk is Restoring Water Flow to the Big Cypress Swamp south of the West Feeder Canal. In a nutshell, this is what we're trying to do. The South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Task Force has assembled a team to look into how to replenish flows into this area of the Big Cypress Swamp / Everglades. It's kind of right at the corner of where the two meet. And this is a presentation that was made on May 21st, 2014. Because we were running out of time at the meeting, it was recommended that I tape the PowerPoint so everybody could review it at their leisure. It's a three-part presentation. The first part is on this idea of developing ecological indicators in downstream natural areas. The engineering community often identifies that as the starting point of that we have to figure out before we make any environmental releases. I contend that while that's important and something we should work towards, it shouldn't limit us from it shouldn't be the limiting reagent on moving forward on part two, defining the environmental releases. And in this part two of the presentation, I use a simple back of the envelope calculation instead of going down that convoluted, complicated road of having a detailed model, which we might need. Let's start simple first, and that's with a back of the envelope calculation. That's what I do in part two. And then part three is a field trip. We went out and we got to look at some of the engineering structures and how they interrelate with the downstream natural area. And that was a lot of fun and wanted to share that with everyone too. But first, we need a cup of coffee, and that's just a brief overview of the history of water management in this area. There is no quick history, of course. There's a lot of projects over the past decades that have been involved in the Everglades and even up in this area of the Everglades. So rest assured, there's a long history that got us to this point. Where are we on the map that we're talking about? We're talking about this area. It's in the northeast corner of the Big Cypress Swamp, or the northwest corner of the Everglades of Water Conservation Area 3. It's where the two meet. And here's a more detailed look. You see the color coding here. Let me explain that real quick. Anything that's a cool color are lower lying areas. Anything that is a warmer color is a higher elevation, maybe pineland. And the arrows show the direction of flow. So you can see in our area of interest right up here, it's a low-lying area where historically inflows, overland flow came from the north, and currently those inflows are not occurring, and they haven't been occurring for the past decades. One thing to keep in mind are this area is really a new piece of the Everglades restoration puzzle. It wasn't designated as conservation land by Congress until 1988, and the land exchange did not occur until 1996. So we're not behind the curve on this thing languishing for decades. It's only in recent times that we've had an opportunity to look at this area as a natural overland flowway for connecting the Seminole National Park Service and Miccosukee conservation lands with that sheet flow, instead of having all that water bypass that natural area in an artificial canal. So it's an exciting opportunity that we're all at the table trying to figure out. In reviewing, about a decade ago, I reviewed the past literature on the water management infrastructure in this area that's kind of consolidated in this this report. And in essence, I'll just review the main points of that report relevant to this discussion. We're all familiar with 1950. I guess it was approved by Congress in 1948, but it was the Central and South Florida project, the Corps of Engineers / South Florida Water Management partnered project. It took about 25 years from 1950 to 75 to implement, and two main parts of that replumbing of the South Florida waterscape were the East Coast and West Coast levee. We all know about the East Coast levee in red, but there is a West Coast levee, and the original idea for it in was for it to be continuous, just like the East Coast levee. However, when they were in the process of building it in the 60s, they discovered, lo and behold, water is flowing from the Big Cypress into the Everglades. So the options were to either levee it all off and pump water across, or leave a gap. And that's 7.5 mile gap was left, and it drains water to the L28 gap from this area. However, the upstream flows were cut off as part of the L28 interceptor and West Feeder Canal. And those waters were diverted through the S190. And here's as seen the S190 on the ground. To the south is to the right here. So water from the West Feeder to the north, the left, flows through the S190, and then it flows on downstream for 18 miles. It flows right through Big Cypress National Preserve. Remember, when this canal was built, Big Cypress National Preserve did not exist. This was all private property land, so the water management imperative was to bypass this water bypass through or around the private property land 18 miles to the south. It's leveed on both sides, so it doesn't get into the swamp. And it finally discharges as a point discharge in the Miccosukee Reservation, which is located in the Northwest Water Conservation Area 3. So 20 years ago, when all the entities got together to start the Everglades restoration process, in this area it seemed like a pretty simple fix. The start and finish were pretty simple, and that fix was identified in these two plans, the Green Book and the Yellow Book. The Green Book is the Seminole Water Conservation Plan, and the yellow is the SERP plan for the entire Everglades. And this diagram provides a summary of how those two plans would dovetail together. The SERP plan calls for moving the S190 5 miles to the south, converting it into a pump station. It also calls for degrading the L28 interceptor levee on the west side to send water into these wetlands. And then it also talks about having the need for upstream surface water treatment areas. And then the Seminole Water Conservation Plan was basically a plan to improve the internal infrastructure for delivering water throughout the reservation, including getting additional flows from Confusion Corner. And also, it gave verbiage to making environmental releases from these three water resources areas in siphons underneath the West Feeder to the south. What we found 20 years later is the solution has turned out to be much more complicated than originally anticipated. And here we are, really 20 years later at the table with plans that have not been started or have been started but not working out as originally conceived. And everyone's sitting here thinking, does anyone know where the new finish line is or when we'll get there? So here we are, 20 years later. Here's the West Feeder. Here's the Big Cypress National Preserve Northeast Addition lands. Here's the Seminole tribes, the natural sloughs and strands located south of the West Feeder. So 15 years later, we still have no water flowing into this natural area that was historically bypassed by canals. And we don't seem to know problems, the impediments. We still have these impediments in front of us, basic questions we can't seem to answer. How much water does the ecosystem need? How much water could be spared from upstream? And what additional engineering is needed? These are basic fundamental questions that 20 years later we're still grappling with. In the meanwhile, no water. So back to the drawing board. We need to refine our existing options, the Green Book and the Yellow Book. We don't abandon those. We refine them. We tweak them. We use adaptive management, and we bring new ideas to the table too. For example, maybe there's other release points. For example, maybe we release water right from the West Weir. Did we ever consider that? Maybe we need to. Maybe we can have direct releases from the West Feeder instead of using the siphons. Maybe we use the siphons too. I think that's part of the solution as well. We have to think about that. And we have to also consider the idea espoused in the SERP plan, degrading the L28 interceptor. How do these all interrelate to one another? But more importantly, and now we're going to go to part one, is to make those releases, do we need to define these ecological indicators first? And that's going to be the next discussion, part one of this three-part series, with what we just concluded here as the introduction. Thank you, and see you at the next session.